Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here again. I'd like to continue my discussion of free will, so let this video serve as part 3 in my video lecture series on this topic. So at the end of my part 2 video lecture on free will, I was discussing Van Inwagen's argument for the claim that compatibilism is false. Now, the argument relies, as we know, on the idea of untouchable facts, and it also seems to rely on an additional principle that we can call the untouchable fact principle. So the argument moves from, just to recap here, step 1, the claim that the past state of the world at any given time is an untouchable fact, but then also the laws of nature, they're an untouchable fact, and then the conjunction of the past state of the world and the laws of nature, so taken together, they're an untouchable fact. And then when we think about the past state of the world and the laws of nature entailing everything that happens at a world, then that too is an untouchable fact. And so we're able to conclude from that everything that happens at the world is an untouchable fact. And this means that even those actions that we take to be ones that we freely perform, they're going to turn out to be untouchable facts. So of course, then we wouldn't be able to act freely with respect to them, because we have to have the ability to do otherwise in order to act freely. But if there's nothing anyone can possibly do to render anything false, including those actions they think they're performing freely, then they really don't perform those actions freely. And they couldn't possibly perform any action freely for that matter. So what's going on here? Well, we understand the first 3 steps pretty well. The move from the 3rd, 4th to the 5th step, that's where we have what's called the untouchable fact principle in operation. So, with the first step, the past state of the world, untouchable fact, laws of nature, untouchable fact, and then in step 3, you just get the conjunction of the past state of the world and the laws of nature. And those are all pretty straightforward. You'd have to have some pretty superhuman powers to render false any of the propositions, any of the relevant propositions here. But then how do we move from the 3rd claim, which takes the conjunction of the past state of the world and the laws of nature, and this claim that is at least a logical consequence of determinism, namely that it's an untouchable fact that the past state of the world and the laws of nature entail everything that happens at a world, thus resulting in the claim that everything that happens at a world is an untouchable fact. Well, according to Van Inwagen, the following principle seems true, and it's that if we suppose that P is an untouchable fact, and we also suppose that the claim that P implies or entails Q is an untouchable fact, then Q is also an untouchable fact. And so you see how Van Inwagen implies this principle in the untouchable fact argument, using the past state of the world and the laws of nature as P, and then how he uses the past state of the world and laws of nature entailing everything that happens at a world as the claim that if P entails Q is an untouchable fact. And then we're able to conclude from that Q is an untouchable fact, and of course Q here is going to be that everything that happens at a world is an untouchable fact. So what's going on here in the move from 3 to 4 to 5 is an application of this very general principle. So to see how the principle works outside of this argument, let's just set the argument aside for just a moment, and let me just try to show that the principle has some intuitive plausibility. Sometimes when you look too closely at the past state of the world and the laws of nature and all the rest, it sometimes seems confusing. But let me give you a different example. Suppose that the last living dinosaur existed millions of years ago. And let's suppose that that's an untouchable fact. And let's suppose we also claim that if the last living dino existed millions of years ago, then Jeremy's never seen a living dino. Then it seems like we can infer from these first 2 suppositions that it's also an untouchable fact that Jeremy's never seen a living dino. There's nothing that I could do to render false. There's nothing that anyone could do, for that matter, anybody human that is, to render false the claim that Jeremy's never seen a living dino. So that's just to show you how the principle has some intuitive plausibility when we think about a different kind of case. So Van Inwagen's using that very same principle in this argument. So if we suppose that the past state of the world and the laws of nature entail everything that happens out of the world, and if we also suppose in the step previous, so the third step, that the past state of the world and the laws of nature themselves are untouchable facts, then everything that happens out of the world is going to be an untouchable fact. And the crucial feature, remember, of an untouchable fact is that there's nothing anyone could possibly do to render the fact false. So no one could render any fact false in a deterministic universe. But now it looks like I can't render false anything, so I have no alternate possibilities open to me, and I can't act freely. So that's a way of understanding what Van Inwagen's argument is against compatibilism. So it's an argument for incompatibilism. So Van Inwagen then wants to accept incompatibilism, the thesis that if free will holds, that determinism must be false. Now, another way of thinking about what incompatibilism maintains is this. In order to have free will, it's necessary that indeterminism be true. And indeterminism is just the denial of determinism. So it would be the claim that the past state of the world and the laws of nature don't entail everything that happens at that world. And so it looks like we can just think about incompatibilism in the following way. Free will requires indeterminism. So Van Inwagen, he wants to be an incompatibilist, but he's thought very carefully about this view. And he thinks ultimately that there's a deep mystery in thinking about incompatibilism once we think about the nature of indeterminism. So Van Inwagen, he wants to say that indeterminism seems to imply randomness. And if randomness is the case, if randomness is what exists in the universe and is that which is responsible for us acting freely, then actually free will has been undercut. And this is because randomness undercuts the control condition that's required for acting freely. So a way of thinking about the argument is that if we suppose that indeterminism is true, then we're going to end up with the conclusion that free will is also impossible. So incompatibilism seems to be in trouble. Again, this is a position that Van Inwagen wants to endorse, but he struggles to see how he can endorse it. So let's see how the argument goes just one more time in thinking about it. There's less sort of technical terminology here, but the first step is just going to be that let's just suppose indeterminism is true. That is to say that that the past state of the world and laws of nature don't entail everything that happens in our world. Well, step 2 is going to be that if indeterminism is true, then at best our actions are random. So indeterminism in the causal chain that leads to our action would have to be required for us to act freely if incompatibilism is right. But what indeterminism amounts to is that there's randomness. And why is there randomness? Well, and why would our actions have to be random? Well, it would have to be the case that there's nothing that sufficiently determines what we do. But if nothing sufficiently determines why we do what we do, then what explains why we do what we do? The actions just happen. But that seems to just amount to being randomness. Randomness just seems to be the thesis that there's no explanation for why it is that something happens. And that's exactly what indeterminism seems to be about, or seems to imply, excuse me. So indeterminism seems to imply that at best our actions are random. And if our actions are at best random, then they can't be free. And this is because randomness rules out the control that would be required for acting freely. And so, very simply, from these two claims, we can infer that if indeterminism is true, then we can't have free will. And so it looks like then what Van Inwagen's left with is saying that if determinism is true, we can't have free will, and that's why the untouchable fact argument. But then likewise, if indeterminism is true, then free will is impossible, and that's because free will also undercuts free will. And this is because indeterminism just means that when we act freely, in fact, we're acting randomly, but to act randomly is to undercut the free will that we have. So what Van Inwagen wants to say at this point is that, look, it looks like free will is impossible. And this is because determinism and indeterminism, they are the only two logical options. So if both these logical options undermine free will, then free will itself would seem to be impossible. But Van Inwagen says this just seems to be the case. He doesn't know where in his arguments a flaw occurs. He'd like to know. He thinks that it's likely that there's something wrong with his argument that indeterminism undermines free will, but he just doesn't know where that happens. So as a consequence, what he says is that, look, I know I have free will, and I think that others know they have free will. Free will seems to exist. So free will just seems to be an absolute mystery, at least now, given where we are in our current development. Perhaps evolution is such that it didn't really endow us with figuring out and resolving these deep philosophical mysteries, and that's why we may struggle with other philosophical questions and problems. Evolution designed us in some sense, in the proper sense of design here, not involving that there's a designer, but it's made us in such a way that we focus on survival, but not abstract philosophical issues or questions. And so Van Inwagen wants to say that free will is one of these ideas that we just don't properly understand yet. Because everywhere you look, there's a mystery in free will. If you accept compatibilism, you have to accept how it is that we can be free, even though everything that we do, everything that happens is an untouchable fact. If incompatibilism is right and indeterminism is required for free will, then another mystery results. How can we be free even though our actions are random? Okay, that's another big mystery. How are we free even though some actions just happen? Even though our free actions would have to just happen. And there'd be no proper explanation for why one action occurs as opposed to another. Now, another position you could take in the debate is that free will is impossible. But another mystery now results. Why on earth does it seem as if we are free? Okay, why does it seem that we hold each other morally responsible and accountable for things? It would seem as if free will is required for these practices. So it seems as if we have free will. So there's another mystery there. So another way of going is just accept that we have free will and just say that it's a mystery how we have it, because it doesn't look like we can establish it by way of argument. And this is Van Inwagen's position. He's what's called a Mysterianist about free will. He thinks that we have it, we can know we have it, but we just don't know how we do. And at least now, in our current stage of development, we don't know how we have it. And perhaps at some future time, as we continue to evolve, we'll be able to figure such a thing out. So, in conclusion, Van Inwagen, he wants to say that the untouchable fact argument underwrites having compatibilist free will, and let's call it the randomness argument undermines having incompatibilist free will. It appears as if those are the only two options, so it looks like in both cases we don't have free will. But Van Inwagen says, of course we have it, and it seems like we know that we have it in a way that goes beyond just a mere argument. And so we've got to believe that we have it. And so let's embrace Mysterianism, the view that free will, at least right now, is an absolute mystery for us. So thanks for watching these videos. Up next is part 4, where I look at an argument that challenges Van Inwagen's untouchable fact argument. Thanks for watching, everybody.